He thought he was about to embarrass her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he was stepping into his own quiet undoing. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the dojo, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor as the steady rhythm of feet against mats echoed through the room. Sharp, controlled, confident. The kind of sound that belonged to people who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted everyone else to know it too. And then the door opened with a soft creak that barely registered at first. But the moment Amanda Carter stepped inside, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle ripple in the air as a few heads turned and eyes scanned her from head to toe, taking in the simple gray hoodie, the worn sneakers, the loosely tied hair that framed a face too calm for a place that thrived on intensity. And in that instant, before a single word was spoken, judgments were already made, conclusions already drawn, and respect already denied. Amanda paused just inside the doorway, her eyes steady as they adjusted to the room, quietly observing the movements, the stances, the small mistakes hidden beneath confident displays, her gaze lingering just a second longer than expected on each pair, as if she were reading something invisible, something deeper than technique. But no one noticed that part. They only saw what they expected to see, a woman out of place, someone who didn't belong, someone easy to dismiss. Across the mat, Brad Hoffman stood with his arms crossed, his black belt tied perfectly at his waist, his posture radiating authority, the kind that came from years of being listened to without question. And when his eyes landed on Amanda, they narrowed just slightly, not with curiosity, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from thinking you've already figured someone out, and in his mind, she was already a distraction, already a problem waiting to be corrected. The class continued for a moment longer, but the rhythm felt different now, slightly off, as whispers began to form at the edges of the room, quiet enough to pretend they weren't there, but loud enough to be felt, and Amanda simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, saying nothing, doing nothing, as if she had all the time in the world. Brad finally stepped forward, his footsteps deliberate against the mat, the kind of walk meant to establish control before a word was even spoken. And when he stopped a few feet away from her, the room seemed to tighten, conversations fading into a low hum as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite on the surface but edged with something sharper underneath, something that didn't quite bother to hide itself. And Amanda met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm, almost gentle when she replied, "I'm here to join the class." For a brief second, there was silence, then a faint chuckle from somewhere in the back, followed by another, and then a few more, like a chain reaction no one bothered to stop, and Brad's lips curved into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't a beginner session," he said, glancing briefly at the others as if inviting them to share in the moment. "We run a serious training environment here." Amanda nodded slightly, as if she had expected that answer, as if nothing about this moment surprised her. And that calm, that quiet composure, somehow made the atmosphere even more uneasy, though no one could quite explain why. A hush settled over the room again, heavier this time, more focused, as if something unseen had just taken its place among them. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and in that stillness, something unspoken lingered, something that hadn't revealed itself yet, but was already changing everything. Brad held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for her to reconsider, as if expecting her to step back, apologize, and quietly leave like so many others had done before. But Amanda did not move, not even slightly, and that stillness began to work against him in a way he did not immediately understand. So he exhaled through his nose and gestured toward the far side of the mat with a dismissive flick of his hand. "You can observe for now," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to make it sound like a concession rather than a rejection, but the message was clear to everyone in the room. She was not being welcomed, she was being tolerated. Amanda nodded once, a small, almost invisible motion, and walked toward the bench along the wall, her steps quiet, measured, unhurried, as if she were not stepping into an unfamiliar environment but returning to something she already knew. And that contrast, subtle as it was, did not go completely unnoticed, at least not by everyone. As she sat down, folding her hands loosely in her lap, her eyes moved across the room again, not with nervousness, but with focus, tracing the patterns of movement, the rhythm of breath, the slight imbalance in footwork here, the hesitation in timing there, details so small they escaped most people. But to her they stood out clearly, like notes slightly off in an otherwise confident performance. On the mat, Brad clapped his hands once, sharp and commanding, bringing the class back into motion. "All right, back to combinations," he called out, his tone returning to its usual controlled intensity. But there was an edge now, something slightly forced, as if he were trying to reassert a sense of order that had been quietly disrupted. And the students responded immediately, lining up, pairing off, executing sequences with renewed energy, each movement louder, faster, more deliberate, as though they were performing not just for themselves, but for the unexpected audience seated at the edge of the room. Carlos Rivera stepped in beside Brad, his expression carrying a hint of amusement as he leaned slightly closer, speaking just low enough that only a few nearby could hear. "You get all kinds walking in these days," he muttered, his eyes flicking briefly toward Amanda before returning to the class, and Brad gave a faint, knowing smirk, the kind shared between people who believed they were in control of the narrative. A few minutes passed, the rhythm of the training growing stronger, the sounds of movement filling the space again, but every so often, someone would glance toward Amanda, curiosity mixing with quiet judgment, and she remained exactly the same, calm, observant, untouched by the shifting energy around her, as if none of it was directed at her at all. Then, during a demonstration, Brad called one of the advanced students forward, a tall man with a confident stance and a freshly tied black belt, and together they began to showcase a sequence, their movements precise, controlled, practiced, each step executed with the intention of impressing. And it did, drawing nods from the class, murmurs of approval, the kind of validation that reinforced the hierarchy already established in the room. Amanda watched closely, her head tilting just slightly, and for a brief moment, her brow softened, not in confusion, but in quiet recognition, as if she had seen something familiar, something almost predictable. And then, just as quickly, her expression returned to neutral. "That is what discipline looks like," Brad said as the demonstration ended, his voice carrying across the room. "Years of commitment, not something you pick up overnight." And though he did not look directly at her, the implication hung in the air unmistakably, drawing a few quiet laughs from the students who understood exactly who the comment was meant for. Carlos stepped forward next, adding his own commentary, his tone lighter but no less pointed. "And it takes more than watching from the sidelines," he said, glancing briefly toward the bench. "You have to earn your place here." And again, the room responded with small reactions, subtle, but collective, reinforcing the invisible line that had been drawn since the moment Amanda walked in. Through it all, she said nothing, did nothing, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her presence almost ghost-like against the wall. But there was something building beneath that stillness, something quiet but unmistakable, like a current running just below the surface, and though no one could name it yet, a few began to feel it. A faint sense that the balance in the room was not as solid as it seemed, that something unseen was waiting, patient and precise, for the exact moment to reveal itself, and when that moment came, it would not need to be loud to be undeniable. The longer Amanda remained seated in silence, the more her stillness began to feel like something else entirely, something that did not match the assumptions that had been made about her, and it was not lost on everyone in the room, especially not on a young student near the back, barely in her 20s, who had been trying to follow the drills but kept glancing toward the bench, her movements growing slightly uncertain as if she sensed something beneath the surface that she could not yet explain. Brad noticed the distraction almost immediately, his sharp eyes catching every break in focus, and he stepped forward with a controlled exhale, clapping once again to reset the room. "Focus," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the air. "If you are not paying attention, you are not improving." And the students quickly adjusted, straightening their posture, tightening their movements, eager to fall back into line. The young student hesitated for just a fraction too long, her timing slightly off as she attempted the next sequence, and that was all it took. Brad walked over, his presence immediate and imposing, stopping just inches from her, his shadow falling across the mat. "Again," he said, his tone lower now, more pointed, and she nodded quickly, repeating the movement, but the hesitation remained, small but visible, and a few students nearby exchanged glances, sensing what was coming next. "No," Brad said, sharper this time, raising a hand to stop her mid-motion. "You are thinking too much, that is your problem." And the room grew quieter, attention shifting toward the interaction, drawn by the familiar pattern of correction that often carried more weight than necessary. The young student swallowed, trying again, her movements slightly faster now, but less controlled, and Brad shook his head, stepping back with a faint, dismissive sigh. "This is not a place for uncertainty," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Either you commit or you sit out." And the words landed harder than they needed to, creating a ripple of discomfort that spread through the group. From the bench, Amanda's gaze did not waver, her eyes steady on the exchange, not with judgment, but with a quiet awareness, as if she recognized something deeper than what was being said, something that went beyond technique or discipline. Carlos watched from the side, arms folded, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, clearly entertained by the tension. And as the young student stepped back, her shoulders slightly lowered, he added casually, "Maybe some people just are not built for this." His tone light, but the implication unmistakable, drawing a few uneasy chuckles from those who did not want to be the next target. The air in the room shifted again, heavier now, more focused, and in that moment, something changed in Amanda, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone could point to, but internally, something subtle yet decisive, like a switch quietly turning into place. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees, her posture no longer passive, and for the first time since she had entered, she spoke, her voice calm but clear, carrying further than expected without needing to rise. "She is not the problem," she said. The words seemed to pause the room itself, conversations halting mid-breath, movement stopping just short of completion, as every eye turned toward her, and even Brad froze for a fraction of a second, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, steady, certain, without hesitation. Carlos let out a short laugh, breaking the silence first. "Excuse me?" he said, turning toward her with raised eyebrows, as if unsure whether to take her seriously or not, and Amanda met his gaze without flinching, her expression unchanged. "Her timing is off because she is adjusting to your rhythm, not her own," she continued, her tone measured, almost instructional. "You are pushing speed before control." A murmur spread through the room, subtle but undeniable, as a few students exchanged looks, uncertain whether to be amused or intrigued, and Brad's expression hardened, his posture straightening as he stepped forward, his authority challenged in a way he had not anticipated. "And you would know that how?" he asked, his voice even, but carrying an edge that signaled the shift from dismissal to confrontation. Amanda did not respond immediately, her eyes briefly moving back to the young student. Then, returning to Brad, and in that small pause, something settled into place, something that could not be undone. "Because she is trying to match you instead of understanding herself?" she said simply. The room went completely still, the kind of silence that felt different from before, not empty but charged, as if something unseen had just crossed an invisible line. And for the first time since she had walked through the door, the balance of the room no longer felt certain. Brad did not respond right away, and that silence, brief as it was, spoke louder than anything he could have said, because for the first time since Amanda had entered the room, he was not entirely in control of what happened next, and everyone felt it, the shift subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had changed direction. His jaw tightened slightly, his posture remaining firm, but there was something new behind his eyes now, something sharper, more focused, no longer dismissive, but calculating. "You have been sitting there for 10 minutes, he said finally, his voice measured, each word placed carefully. "Watching a class you clearly do not understand, and now you are giving instruction?" A few students shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet, and no one moved to break the tension. Amanda rose slowly from the bench, not in defiance, not in haste, but with a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if she had already accepted what was coming and had no intention of avoiding it. Her movements were smooth, unforced, and as she stepped onto the mat, the sound of her shoes against the floor seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the stillness that had settled over the room. "I am not giving instruction," she replied, her voice steady. "I am pointing out what you missed." A murmur rippled through the group, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore, and Carlos let out a low whistle under his breath, shaking his head with a grin that carried equal parts disbelief and anticipation. "This should be interesting," he said quietly, folding his arms as he leaned back slightly, clearly enjoying the moment as it unfolded. Brad took a step closer, closing the distance between himself and Amanda, his presence intended to reassert authority, to remind her and everyone else exactly where they stood. But she did not step back, did not lower her gaze, did not give him the reaction he expected, and that absence of response only made the moment more intense. "All right," he said, his tone shifting again, this time carrying a trace of challenge beneath the surface. "If you think you see something we do not, then show us." The words hung in the air like a line drawn in the sand, and for a second, no one breathed, no one moved, the entire room suspended in anticipation. Amanda turned slightly, her attention returning to the young student who still stood uncertainly at the edge of the mat, her posture tense, her confidence shaken, and Amanda's expression softened just a fraction, not with sympathy, but with understanding. "Try it again," she said gently, her voice directed at the student. Not at Brad, not at Carlos, but at the one person who needed to hear it most. "But slow it down, do not chase their rhythm, find your own." The student hesitated, glancing briefly at Brad, as if seeking permission, but he said nothing, his arms now crossed, his expression unreadable, and after a moment, she nodded, stepping forward, taking a breath, and beginning the sequence again. This time, her movements were different, not faster, not more forceful, but more deliberate, each step placed with intention, her balance steadier, her timing more controlled, and as she moved, something shifted, not dramatically, not perfectly, but enough to be noticed. A few students leaned in slightly, their expressions changing from passive observation to quiet curiosity, and even Carlos straightened just a bit, his smirk fading into something more thoughtful. The sequence ended, and for a brief second no one spoke, the room holding its breath as if waiting for someone to define what had just happened. And then Brad exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the student, then on Amanda and back again. "Again," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain, and the student repeated the movement, this time with even more confidence, the hesitation beginning to fade, replaced by something steadier, something real. The silence that followed was different from before, not tense, not mocking, but reflective, as if the room itself was recalibrating, adjusting to a reality that no one had expected to face. Carlos shifted his weight, clearing his throat lightly, his earlier amusement replaced with a more cautious curiosity, and Brad remained still, his mind clearly working through something he could not yet fully articulate. Amanda stepped back slightly, her role in the moment complete, her expression returning to its calm, neutral state, but the impact of what she had done lingered in the air, impossible to dismiss, impossible to ignore, and for the first time since she had walked through the door, no one in that room was quite as certain as they had been before. The silence that followed did not break the way it usually did, not with a joke or a dismissive comment or a quick return to routine, but with something heavier, something that settled into the space and refused to move, and Brad felt it more than anyone, that subtle erosion of certainty that had always defined his presence in the room. He uncrossed his arms slowly, his posture shifting as he stepped forward again. But this time there was no immediate command, no sharp instruction to reclaim control, only a measured pause as he studied Amanda with a new kind of attention, one that no longer assumed it had already figured her out. "You corrected her," he said finally, his voice quieter now, but carrying a different weight. "But correction is easy when you are standing on the outside." And though the words were calm, there was a challenge beneath them, something deliberate, something designed to draw a line once again. A few students nodded slightly, relieved to recognize a familiar tone returning, something that suggested the structure of the room might still hold, and Carlos, sensing the shift, stepped closer with a faint grin, his earlier confidence returning just enough to fill the gap. "Exactly," he added, glancing toward Amanda. "Anyone can point out mistakes, that does not mean they can do better." And a few quiet murmurs followed, cautious but supportive, as if the room itself was trying to restore the balance it had just lost. Amanda did not respond immediately, her gaze moving briefly across the students, taking in their expressions, the uncertainty, the curiosity, the hesitation, and then returning to Brad, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in that same quiet steadiness that had unsettled them from the beginning. "Then let me stand inside," she said simply. The words landed with a clarity that cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have, and for a moment no one reacted, as if the meaning needed an extra second to settle into place, and when it did, the shift was immediate. Carlos let out a short laugh, louder this time, more open, turning slightly to the others as if inviting them to share in the absurdity. "You want to step in?" he said, his tone light but edged with disbelief. "With us?" And though a few students smiled, the reaction was not as strong as it might have been earlier, the confidence behind it slightly diminished by what they had already seen. Brad remained still, his eyes fixed on Amanda, searching for something, a sign of uncertainty, hesitation, anything that would confirm his original judgment. But there was nothing there, no flicker of doubt, no need for approval, only a calm certainty that made the moment feel far more serious than anyone had expected. "This is not a demonstration class," he said, his voice steady. "We do not entertain challenges." And yet, even as he spoke, there was a subtle shift in his tone, not quite refusal, not quite acceptance, something in between, something unresolved. Amanda took a small step forward onto the center of the mat, her movement unforced, almost natural, as if the space had always belonged to her, and that simple action, that quiet crossing of an invisible boundary, carried more weight than any declaration could have. The room tightened again, attention locking onto the center, the energy shifting from uncertainty to anticipation, and even those who had been skeptical found themselves leaning in slightly, drawn by something they could not quite name. The young student, the one who had struggled earlier, watched closely now, her expression no longer anxious, but focused, as if she sensed that what was about to happen mattered in a way that went beyond technique or hierarchy. Carlos straightened fully, the amusement in his expression fading into something more alert, more cautious, and he glanced briefly at Brad, as if waiting for a signal, for a decision that would define the moment. Brad inhaled slowly, his gaze still locked on Amanda, and in that breath something shifted again, not in the room, but within him, a recognition he could not ignore, that this was no longer about maintaining control, but about confronting something he did not yet understand. He stepped back half a pace, just enough to open the space between them, and though the movement was small, it carried a meaning that everyone felt. "All right," he said, his voice even, but no longer dismissive. "Show us." And the room went completely still, not out of tension this time, but out of expectation, as if every person present understood, without needing to say it, that whatever happened next would not be easily forgotten. No one moved when Brad gave the signal, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to exist in a suspended silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that signals something irreversible is about to unfold, and Amanda did not rush to fill it. She simply stepped forward another half step, her posture relaxed, her shoulders loose, her breathing steady, as if the attention surrounding her did not exist, as if the expectation pressing in from every direction could not reach her. Carlos exchanged a quick glance with Brad, then stepped onto the mat with a casual confidence that had not fully left him, though there was something more cautious beneath it now, something quieter, something that had replaced the earlier amusement without completely erasing it. "All right," Carlos said, rolling his shoulders slightly as he positioned himself across from her, keeping a respectful distance. "Let us see what you have." And though his tone remained light, his stance told a different story, more attentive, more deliberate, his movements no longer careless. Amanda gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement of the challenge, but as if confirming something to herself, and then she settled into position, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just simple, balanced, grounded in a way that did not draw attention at first glance, but held something unmistakably precise beneath the surface. Around them, the students instinctively stepped back, forming a loose circle, their earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet anticipation, their eyes fixed on the center, watching for any sign that would confirm what they still half believed, that this was just a moment that would pass, that things would return to normal. Brad remained at the edge, arms no longer crossed, his focus sharp, his expression unreadable, and for the first time, he was not preparing to correct, not preparing to instruct, but simply watching. Carlos made the first move, not aggressive, not reckless, but controlled, stepping in with a measured pace, testing distance, observing response, and Amanda responded with equal calm, adjusting her position with minimal movement, her timing exact, her awareness complete, and there was something in that exchange, something subtle but immediate, that shifted the perception in the room. It was not what she did, but how she did it, the efficiency, the absence of hesitation, the clarity of each motion, and those watching began to notice, one by one, the small details that did not match their expectations. Carlos paused, just briefly, his eyes narrowing as he recalibrated, his earlier confidence giving way to a more focused attention, and then he tried again, adjusting his approach, more deliberate this time, more precise, and Amanda met him with the same quiet control, her movements minimal, her positioning exact, guiding the interaction without forcing it, responding without overreacting, and in that exchange, something became undeniable. The room went silent again, but this time it was different, deeper, not driven by tension or anticipation, but by recognition, as if everyone present had just witnessed something they could not easily explain, but could not ignore. A student near the back shifted forward slightly, her eyes widening just a fraction, and another leaned in there earlier. Skepticism dissolving into quiet focus, their attention no longer casual, but fully engaged. Carlos stepped back half a pace, his expression no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but thoughtful, almost unsettled, as he processed what he had just experienced, and for a moment, he said nothing, something that in itself spoke volumes. Amanda remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her presence calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, and that contrast, that lack of reaction, only amplified the impact of what everyone had just seen. Brad took a slow step forward, his gaze fixed on her, his mind clearly working through something deeper than technique, something that challenged more than just his expectations, and the authority he carried into the room earlier now felt different, quieter, more measured. No one spoke, no one moved, and in that stillness, a new understanding began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet spoken, but impossible to deny, and for the first time since Amanda had entered, the room was no longer judging her. It was trying to understand her, and that shift, silent as it was, changed everything. No one applauded, no one spoke, and yet the weight of what had just happened pressed into every corner of the room, settling into the silence like something permanent, something that could not be undone, and Carlos, who had always filled moments like this with quick remarks or confident laughter, said nothing. His eyes still fixed on Amanda as if searching for a flaw, a mistake, anything that would restore the balance he was used to, but there was nothing there to grab onto. Amanda did not move to claim the moment, did not look around for validation, did not even shift her stance. She simply stepped back a few inches, giving space again, as if what had just happened required no explanation, no celebration, no acknowledgement at all. Brad finally broke the silence, but not in the way anyone expected. His voice lower than before, more measured, almost careful. "Where did you train?" he asked, and though the question was simple, it carried something deeper, something that had replaced the earlier judgment with a need to understand. Amanda glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged, and for a second, it seemed like she might not answer. But then she spoke, her tone calm, almost reflective. "Different places?" she said, not offering details, not trying to impress, just stating it as a fact that did not need elaboration. A few students exchanged looks, clearly unsatisfied with the answer, their curiosity growing now that their assumptions had been challenged, and Carlos shifted his weight slightly, crossing his arms again, though the gesture no longer carried the same certainty it had before. "Different places," he repeated, a faint edge returning to his voice, though it was softer now, less convincing. "That is not much of an explanation," and Amanda met his gaze without hesitation. "It is enough," she replied. The room absorbed that exchange quietly, the tension no longer sharp, but still present, still shaping the atmosphere. And the young student from earlier stepped forward just slightly, her hesitation replaced by something new, something steadier. "Can you show me again?" she asked, her voice tentative but sincere, directed at Amanda rather than the instructors, and that small shift, that change in who she chose to look to, did not go unnoticed. Brad's eyes flickered toward the student, then back to Amanda, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that acknowledged the change in the room, the shift in influence that had begun to take place. Amanda nodded once, stepping closer to the student, her movements calm, her focus clear, and she guided her through the sequence again, not with authority, not with commands, but with quiet direction, adjusting posture, slowing timing, emphasizing balance over speed, and as the student followed, her movements improved, not dramatically, but noticeably, enough to build confidence, enough to create something real. The others watched in silence, no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but attentive, their earlier judgments fading into something more thoughtful, more cautious, as they began to reconsider what they thought they knew. Carlos let out a slow breath, his expression shifting into something more neutral, his earlier smirk gone completely now, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement he did not voice, and Brad remained still, observing everything with a focus that had changed entirely, no longer evaluating Amanda as an outsider, but as something else, something he had not yet defined. When the sequence ended, the student straightened, a small smile breaking through her earlier uncertainty, and she looked at Amanda with genuine appreciation. "That felt different?" she said softly, and Amanda gave a slight nod. "Because it was yours?" she replied. The words lingered in the air, simple but precise, carrying a meaning that extended beyond the moment, beyond the technique, and into something deeper, something that resonated with more than just one person. The room did not erupt, did not shift dramatically, but something had undeniably changed, something quiet but powerful, and for the first time since the class had begun, the hierarchy that had once felt so fixed now seemed uncertain, no longer defined by titles or belts alone, but by something far more difficult to measure, and in that realization, the silence returned not empty, but full, as if everyone present was beginning to understand that they had just witnessed something they could not easily forget. The room did not return to normal after that moment, and that was what unsettled them the most. Not what Amanda had done, but what she had quietly changed. Something beneath the surface that no one could easily name, yet everyone could feel. The usual rhythm of the class, the predictable flow of instruction and correction, no longer fit the space the same way, and even the smallest movements now carried a different weight, as if every action was being reconsidered through a new lens. Brad took a slow breath, his gaze shifting across the room, noticing the way the students stood, the way their attention had shifted, no longer anchored solely to him, but divided, thoughtful, aware in a way that had not been there before, and for a moment he said nothing, not because he lacked words, but because he understood that anything he said now would matter more than it had before. Carlos broke the silence. First, though his voice was no longer as light as it once had been. "All right," he said, clearing his throat slightly. "Let us keep moving." But even as he spoke, the authority behind his words felt thinner, less automatic, and the students responded more slowly, their movements hesitant, their focus divided between routine and reflection. Amanda stepped back from the center, returning the space without ceremony, without claiming it, as if she had never intended to take it at all, and that choice, that quiet withdrawal, spoke more clearly than any display of skill could have. The young student remained where she was for a second longer, her posture more upright now, her breathing steadier, and when she stepped back into line, she carried something new with her, something subtle but visible, and those around her noticed, even if they did not say it aloud. Brad watched this carefully, his mind working through the implications, the shift in influence, the change in energy, and for the first time he seemed less concerned with maintaining authority and more focused on understanding what had just happened. He turned back toward Amanda, his expression no longer guarded, no longer dismissive, but measured, almost thoughtful. "You corrected more than her timing," he said, his voice quieter, not directed at the room, but at her, and Amanda met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she replied simply. She corrected it herself. The distinction settled into the air, quiet but precise, and a few students exchanged glances again. This time not out of uncertainty, but recognition, as if something they had not been able to articulate before had just been made clear. Carlos shifted slightly, his earlier confidence replaced now by something closer to respect. Though he did not say the word, did not acknowledge it directly, instead choosing to observe, to listen, to process in silence. Brad nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he had not expected to confront, and then he turned back to the class, his posture straightening, but not in the same way as before, not as a display of control, but as a recalibration of it. "Pair up again," he said, his voice steady, but different, less sharp, more grounded, "and take your time." And the words themselves were simple, but the tone behind them had changed, carrying a weight that had not been there earlier, one that reflected a shift not just in instruction, but in perspective. The students moved into position, their movements more deliberate now, less rushed, more aware, and as they began again, the energy in the room felt quieter, but stronger, less about proving something, more about understanding it. Amanda remained at the edge once more, her presence calm, her role undefined but undeniable, and no one looked at her the same way anymore. Not as an outsider, not as someone who did not belong, but as someone who had revealed something essential, something that had always been there, but had gone unnoticed. The room did not erupt, did not celebrate, but it shifted, deeply and permanently, and in that quiet transformation, something more powerful than any display of dominance had taken place, something that could not be undone. And as the sounds of movement slowly returned, they carried a different meaning now, one shaped not by assumption, but by awareness, and in that awareness, the true balance of the room began to emerge. The class continued, but nothing about it felt the same, not in the way the students moved, not in the way they listened, and certainly not in the way they looked at Amanda, because something quiet yet undeniable had settled into the space, something that could not be undone simply by returning to routine. The sounds of footsteps against the mat resumed, measured and deliberate, but now there was intention behind them, a level of awareness that had not existed before, as if each person had been forced to reconsider what they believed skill truly meant. Brad moved among them, offering corrections, adjusting posture, guiding timing, but his approach had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention. Yet the difference was there, subtle and significant, his voice no longer sharp with assumption, but grounded in observation, his instructions no longer about control but about understanding. Carlos followed the same shift, though more quietly, his earlier confidence now replaced with a more thoughtful presence. And while he still spoke, still guided, there was a pause before his words now, a consideration that had not been there before. Amanda remained at the edge of the room, her presence steady, her expression calm, watching without interference, and no one questioned her being there anymore. No one dismissed her, because the space itself had already made that decision. The young student continued her practice, her movements more confident, her timing more natural, and each repetition reinforced something deeper than technique, something internal, something that could not be taught through pressure alone. As the session neared its end, the energy in the room settled into a quiet focus, not exhausted, not drained, but grounded, and Brad finally called for a pause, his voice carrying across the space. "That is enough for today," he said, and the students relaxed slightly, stepping back, wiping sweat from their hands, exchanging glances that now carried more respect than before. There was no immediate rush to leave, no casual chatter breaking the atmosphere, only a lingering stillness, as if everyone understood that the day had been different, that something had shifted in a way that mattered. Brad turned toward Amanda once more, closing the distance between them not with authority, but with intention, and when he stopped a few feet away, he held her gaze, no longer trying to assess her, no longer trying to place her within his understanding, but acknowledging something he could not ignore. "You could have taken over that room," he said, his voice quiet, honest. "But you did not." And Amanda looked at him for a moment, her expression unchanged, her presence still grounded in that same quiet certainty, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "It was never mine to take," she replied. The words settled between them, simple, but carrying a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room, beyond the roles they had both stepped into earlier. Carlos approached as well, stopping just behind Brad, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful, and though he did not speak immediately, the absence of his usual remarks said enough, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no elaboration. The students began to gather their things, but more than a few lingered, their eyes returning to Amanda, not out of curiosity now, but respect, the kind that forms without being asked, without being demanded. The young student stepped forward again, her earlier hesitation completely gone, replaced by a quiet confidence, and she offered Amanda a small smile, one that carried gratitude without needing words, and Amanda returned it just as simply, without drawing attention to it, without making it into something larger than it was. The lights in the dojo dimmed slightly as the evening settled in. The golden lines across the floor softened